And if you don't wish to be recorded, you can turn off your camera, or you can reach out to either me or Sarah. And please feel free to put all your comments or questions in the chat throughout the event. There's definitely going to be time at the end for question and answers. If there are any specific questions or needs, please do feel free to reach out to me or Sarah, and we will definitely try to see what we can do. I'll start with the land acknowledgement. And so we can never work to end the systematic and institutional violence if we do not center the narratives of Indigenous peoples in our collective decision making for social justice and equity. As settlers in Turtle Island, we directly benefit from the colonization and genocide of the Indigenous people of this land. In order to engage in resistance and solidarity against the injustices inflicted on Indigenous people, it's imperative that we constantly engage in acts of decolonization. Toronto is in the dish with the one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers like us have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. And now, to ensure that we are creating a safe space for all to attend and participate, I will read out our equity statement. As members of this community, mutual respect, cooperation, and understanding is our goal. We shall neither condone nor tolerate behavior that undermines the dignity or self esteem of any individual or create an intimidating, hostile, or offensive environment. It is our collective responsibility to create a space that is inclusive and welcomes discussion. Any form of discrimination and harassment will not be tolerated. Hate speech rooted in, but not limited to, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, sexist, racist, classist, ableist, homophobic, or transphobic sentiments and or remarks will not be tolerated. We all have an obligation to ensure that an open and inclusive space free of hate is established. Any behavior that does not demonstrate an understanding of these principles and or creates an unsafe atmosphere will not be accepted. Today's forum will focus on how we can build solidarity between Indigenous and newcomer communities. Since its inception, Canada has fostered stories, tells about itself to the world and to its own communities. These stories are intended to erase historical violence, hide racial hierarchy, and justify ongoing colonial realities. In these narratives, Canada is depicted as a nation established by settling a wilderness, establishing peaceful trading relations with Indigenous peoples, and welcoming the downtrodden from across the globe into a multicultural, tolerant haven. State policies and structures have been um, we have someone who's not on mute. And structures have been instrumental in quite divergent stories. By growing our understanding of responsibilities and stepping into transformative actions as settlers in this land,
Sorry, Chris, can you unmute Gia?
Hi, Sarah, can you hear me?
Yes, we unmuted you. Sorry about that.
Sorry about that. So yeah, what I was saying was that by growing our understandings, owning of responsibilities, and stepping into transformative actions as settlers on this land, we will shatter the myths and disrupt the ways Canada has sought to position newcomers in relation with the Indigenous people. Now, I have the pleasure to introduce our own sister, Adibola, who is with us in the Sister to Sister program, who is going to be moderating the session. And I cannot wait to hear this engaging conversation that I'm sure that's going to happen. Adebola recently graduated from the Honors Bachelor of Child Development program at Seneca College. She's a passionate educator and an anti-Black racism advocate. She's the founder of the Afro Women and Youth Foundation. She's a certified speaker, coach, and trainer with the John Maxwell team. She's a board member at the Family Support Institute of Ontario. She currently supports survivors of sexual gender-based violence as a crisis line counselor at the Women's Support Network of York Region. Adebola was named as one of the 150 Women of Inspiration 2020, winner of the Seneca Helix Female Entrepreneur 2019, winner of the United Way Greater Toronto's Black Community Leadership Award 2020, and the recipient of the 2020-21 Seneca's prestigious Stephen E. Quinlan Award, which is presented to a student with strong academic achievement, demonstrating personal integrity, sound character, tenacity, and assisting others in the community beyond Seneca College. I'll hand it over to you, Adebola. I am really looking forward to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Gia. That was okay. Yeah, thank you, Gia. I think you also have to introduce the panelists, Gia. Thank you for introducing me. You have to introduce the panelists also.
That's okay. I think you can just introduce the panelists, read their names, and we can take it from there.
Sarah?
I'm listening.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have bio with me right here.
That's okay. I think we are really excited to welcome the panelists. We have Dr. Mona Saleh, and we have Nada Audi, and we have Pam as well. The reason why we won't be reading the panelist bio is we really wanted to hear from their own about introducing themselves and learning a little bit more about their stories. So you can just start right in.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Gia, for that introduction and the learned acknowledgement. I'm so happy to be here tonight, and it's a great privilege to be moderating this session. As we begin our conversation today, we ask each of our panelists to open with their own doorways into the dialogue and into relation with one another as Indigenous, settler, newcomer, and racialized women. How about we start with Pamela? Is that okay? So my first question, what are some of the untruths that influence the newcomer views regarding Indigenous histories and contemporary life in Canada?
If it's okay, I'll just introduce myself quickly. Wawata Seimana Dukwe Indishnakas, Bachawana First Nation in Dunjaba, Mungin Dodam, Nishnabé Kwe Dao. I'm actually coming to you from my home territory. I'm home right now, which I love. So yeah, it's just, I feel really good here. So could you just read the question again, please?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. What are some of the lies that influence the newcomer views regarding Indigenous histories and contemporary life in Canada?
I think, being here, it's kind of difficult to kind of assess what those untruths are. But I think that the reality is the truth is never shared. I think that folks think that they're coming to Canada and it's the land of the free. It's a place where you can, access resources, you can, live your life the way you want. But the reality is no one talks about how that came to be. So no one talks about the pre-150 plus years that Canada was formed, who was here first, how we lived off the land when we were a vibrant culture prior to colonization. I know that the statutes within, for new immigrants includes treaties, but I don't know outside of just the idea of treaty, what is really established or talked about. So that's a little concerning. I think that one of the things that you can do when you come is, the area that you move into, it's good to locate yourself. Who was there before? Who lives there now? Who has moved through the area? We never stayed in the same spot. We like to move. We would have never, so where I am, we would have never stayed close to Lake Superior all the time. Those winds pick up real quick on Lake Superior, and it becomes incredibly unsafe. If you've ever fished it, you would know where the islands are within Lake Superior, because you can get to them quickly to be safe for a couple days. Never forget, that's my classic uncle story. My uncle was gone for 3 days. The lake was up, and my aunt sent out to search and rescue. That's what they called it. They came in, and my uncle had a fire going. He was eating, and they were like, are you Percy Agua? And he said, well, I am, but who are you? And he's like, your wife's worried. And he's like, she should know better. So really get to know the people that are in the land, like from the lands that you are welcoming yourself on, or have been welcomed by, as you arrive. I think that those are keys. I think really thinking about pre-formation of Canada is an integral part of being here.
Okay, thank you very much, Pamela. My first question is also more of an introduction. It says that panelists open up their own doorway. So it's a question to introduce yourself, to tell us more about you, what you do, so we can get to know you better. So I don't know if there are other things you still want to tell us about yourself. I know you answered the question. I just think maybe there's still other things you want us to still know about you.
Sure. I mean, I introduced myself in the language. I shared with you the name that was gifted to me by my Auntie Miriam. It loosely translates to Spirit Lightning Woman. These women have known me since I was a baby. My first name was gifted to me by my grandfather, Grandpa Fred, and he called me Sweet. So I'd like to believe it was my birthday is in April, that sap water, that sweet water is running, and it had a connection to, the land. Everything connects to who we are. Spirit Lightning Woman came later when I was in a coordinator role, and my aunties are like, you need to speak your truth at all times. This name will help guide you on your path in this physical world. Batchewana First Nation is the community I'm from, and it's just right near me now, which makes me happy. And I currently will be seconded to the Ministry of Education in the fall. So I'm moving out of the public school board I work in for a few years to try something new and different. I'm a mom to 3 girls who typically get along, but one's a teen, so you know how that goes if you have teenage children, especially girls. I think most of my life these days is driven by what example am I setting for them? What foundation am I laying for them as they grow older in this physical world, find their path and what they're meant to do. And I just really hope they can do it without, the layers of fear that live inside of me based on the structure and the systems that I've grown up in.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Thank you. I hope that in your new role with the Minister of Education, there will be a change in the education system. When I was at Seneca College, I took a course, an Indigenous course, and as a newcomer, I thought it was because I was new that I was hearing those things for the first time. But there were people in my class who had been in Canada from age 3, 4, 5, and they didn't know what I was learning just last year. So it's so obvious that there is need for a change in the curriculum, and hopefully we get there someday. Thank you, Pamela. So Muna, over to you. I'd like you to tell us about yourself.
Thank you very much. Would you like me to answer both questions as well?
Oh, yes, the introduction and the question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'll begin I always begin with the dua, so I'm going to say a dua right now. ربي اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. So thank you to the Newcomer Women's Services Toronto and Newcomer Students Association for hosting this important discussion. And thank you, Adebola, for moderating, and to all the organizers for inviting us into this space tonight. So I want to, before I begin, I want to honor and acknowledge that I'm currently in Treaty 6 territory, a home place for many Indigenous nations and communities, including Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, and Nakota Sioux peoples. As a daughter and granddaughter of Palestinian refugees, I intimately know the intergenerational reverberations of settler colonial violence and injustice in my family. And I'm committed to my responsibilities as a treaty person and as a settler on these lands, as someone implicated in the ongoing genocide against Indigenous peoples and communities on these lands, and as an educator for justice. So I just want to begin by saying that I am an assistant professor at Concordia University of Edmonton. I have 3 children ranging in age from 8 to 18, and I'm also a narrative inquirer. So throughout my work in scholarship, I share my roots as an intergenerational survivor of violent Palestinian displacement and dispossession. Because how else can I really illuminate the ongoing trauma many of us and our students grapple with on an everyday basis? How else can I make visible the intergenerational knowing and wisdoms running through our veins? For as Thomas King so powerfully asserted, the truth about stories is that that's all that we are. Alongside all the amazing women on this panel, mashallah, and so many others who are building solidarities in many different ways and spaces, I'm working hard to change the stories that I live by and with and in, inshallah. Especially stories that position us first or second generation or subsequent generation racialized settlers as needing to be quote unquote grateful for being quote unquote included here. Stories that expect us to show this so-called gratitude by never speaking up or critiquing the ongoing violence of settler colonialism, anti-Black racism, xenophobia, ableism, and too many other intersecting systems. And I'm using Kimberly Crenshaw's notion of intersectionality here, that are very much shaping our lives and experiences within these lands. But yet here we are, alhamdulillah. And so I'm going to answer the second part by drawing on my research alongside Muslim mothers and daughters. Like when you're asking what are some of the untruths that influence the newcomer views regarding Indigenous histories and contemporary life in Canada. So my doctoral research was an inquiry into the experiences, a narrative inquiry into the experiences of Muslim mothers and daughters. And all of the youth and women in that research have been in Canada for at least 20 years. Our discussions reveal that over time, they have learned many of the truths of Indigenous histories and contemporary life that have been too often hidden, smoothed over, or outright erased, including in the Citizenship Guide. So these include knowledge of the racist and still in effect, quote unquote, Indian Act, residential schools, the 60s scoop, missing and murdered Indigenous girls and women, and alongside the overrepresentation of Indigenous youth and adults and so-called care systems, and also, of course, carceral systems. And so over time, we have learned these truths. However, the mothers who have been more recently researching alongside are, and I'm going to say this slowly, they're Muslim mothers, and the reason why there's so many layers to this research, Muslim mothers of disabled, and I use the backslash with the dis, because to show that it's more, people aren't disabled in and of themselves. Society is what's disabling. So Muslim mothers of disabled children who recently arrived as refugees. And so these women did not learn about these histories, their reverberations and current realities as part of preparing for Canadian citizenship, which they've been doing for the last several years. And I think that that's absolutely an abdication of responsibility, but also I think it is also very purposeful. Because how else can we say that this is a tolerant / welcoming / multicultural / whatever, inclusive, whatever euphemism you want to use, if you tell the hard truths? In too many people's eyes, it's not, we can't tell these truths, because then how do we story ourselves as this nation that others see us as? But this is not only an issue for recently arrived settlers. I was born in Misquitchie, Wisconsin, which is also known as Edmonton, in Treaty 6 lands. And I'm 41 years old, and I've only recently learned about Indigenous histories, the truth of Indigenous histories, within the last 15 years. And I know I still have so much to learn. So this ongoing erasure makes me really think of who has the power to control that narrative, and who's really benefited from the incomplete and often outright untruthful narrativizations of these histories and ongoing realities.
Thank you very much, Muna, for that wonderful contribution. I just want to link what he said to what Pamela said. Pamela said, she said that the truth is never shared. And you also just said that you only started learning about 15 years ago, and you're now 41. So that just confirms what Pamela said and what I also experienced at Seneca College. It is very sad that we are, living in this country, and we are not, people who even grew up in this country don't even know the history of indigenous people, and it is very, very sad. But hopefully we'll continue this conversation. We'll get more people to know about what's happening, and we get more people to also become advocates and get involved, and hopefully we'll see changes in the near future. Thank you very much, Muna. Thank you, Pamela. I'm sorry. Yeah, and then I'll go to Nada. The same question. So do you want me to read the question again, or
no? I've got it in front of me. Can you hear me well?
Sure. Very cool.
Okay, great. So hi, I'm Nada Audi. I'm a settler and living today on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe people. And where I reside is the meeting place of two treaties, the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit and those of the First Nations of the William Treaty. And the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation are the closest Indigenous community to where we are. I am a migrant to these lands, Palestinian displaced intergenerationally several times over. I center this in my introduction because it is my doorway into the relationships with this land, this place, and the peoples who are Indigenous to it. Now, my family came here 30 years ago, and during that time, these relationships have shifted and changed from complicity in erasure and invisibility of Indigenous peoples to a distorted connection in which I was still centered, which came from understanding Canada to be a racist nation, and that I, as a racialized person, had to struggle against what I thought was just like Indigenous communities, colleagues, and families. But then I would say in the last 7 or 8 years, there's been increasingly a decentering of self as a settler, and the growing comprehension of the struggle against settler colonialism, what decolonization and self-determination mean on Turtle Island, and the global connections of that. And the need to locate all of our struggles in the context of Indigenous peoples' struggles for self-determination. And this latest learning and shift really has come through generous relationships with Indigenous people like my friend Pam, and through Indigenous people's teaching and writing. And so wrestling with my settler identity and connections to being Palestinian, I'm finding my way forward to hold both realities in one consciousness, and to learn how to actually work actively against what is a colonial state, and which has been really set up to benefit whiteness and Christianity. And having spaces like this, I think, are important because it gives us the chance to disrupt the stories, as both Pam and Muna have said so beautifully. The stories about this nation that we've all internalized, living here or through our migration journeys, and to then actually think and plan how we actively work against colonialism and whiteness and manage the precarious state that Muna was referring to in terms of how we've been placed as racialized migrants and newcomers who are actually beneficiaries and complicit in settler colonial state, but then always put in this othering probationary condition of belonging to Canada. So I think by listening to counter stories from Indigenous communities, we grow our understanding of the impact and legacies and the present day actions that's essential to decolonizing ourselves and to really think in very intentional ways about what solidarity can look like. But we also need to recognize the ways that we benefit from violent removal and displacement and the erasure of Indigenous peoples and families and communities. And knowing that it's not on Indigenous people and communities to teach us how to decolonize ourselves, our minds, and our actions. That's actually the work that we have to engage with ourselves. I think that there's this misnomer that to take the lead from Indigenous communities means I sit back in my innocence and expect Indigenous communities to teach me. So what we actually have to do is shed this Eurocentric idea that I have to be an expert, which actually creates a paralysis from doing any work. So as a racialized woman, as a Muslim, as a Palestinian, I've spent time and given of my patience and my compassion to support thinking and struggles for those who have wanted to be in solidarity with me in my communities. But there's also times where I've had to say to people like, no, I am out. I need you to struggle through this and I need you to figure this out on your own. And so we also need to think about that as we engage in solidarity work with Indigenous communities. We need to respect and acknowledge that it's not on those that have been impacted most by injustice to assuage our guilt and to teach us how to counter injustice. And so, you know, I love your first question about untruths, because I think that's where we start. We have to actually shatter the untruths that Canada not only tells us here, but around the world. Because, you know, for those of us who have come from other places, we have these images in our head between, you know, the multiculturalism to the blue berets to the whatever it is that we have been taught that Canada is. And then, you know, learning how to walk beside and learn with and from Indigenous communities. So I think for me, the untruth that we really need to shatter, that is colonialism, is something that's happened in the past. It is alive and well. And I think if the events of the last month have not told us something about that, then we really need a wake-up call. That and the other piece is that as migrants to this land, that if our family has come here recently, and this for me was generously and kindly and compassionately taught to me, because I thought, wait a minute, I just got here. And, you know, I'm not benefiting from whiteness. So, you know, how can I be a settler? How can I be claimed in this same category? And, you know, Professor Susan Dion, who's at York University, has this beautiful line. If you'll just give me a sec to read it to you, as she said, whether your family came last week or your ancestors came 300 years ago, this land was made available to you and your family because Indigenous people were removed from this land. And thus, whether you know it or not, whether you appreciate it or not, you are in relationship with Indigenous people individually and collectively. We have inherited a history. And so I hope that through our conversation today, that we'll, you know, be thinking about the ways that each of us can engage in this work. And, you know, even in our conversations within our own families, we can disrupt these myths that Canada has taught all of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nada. You really said a lot, and I'm so happy to listen to you. I think one thing that stood out for me is the fact that you made the working with Indigenous communities sound a little easy than what I had always imagined. Because, you know, like you feel if you don't have anybody who is Indigenous, you're not able to do anything, you're not able to do much. But from what you said with patience and compassion, we can learn to move in solidarity. We can learn beside them, learn from them, learn with them. So gradually we'll begin to make the changes that we want to see. And we can even start in our own homes, in our environment, in our communities. We can begin to do little things that would eventually make big impact. Thank you very much, Nada. That was very, very enlightening. Thank you. For our participants, if you have questions, please leave your questions in the chat. We will still we'll get to that at the end of the session. And that leads me to my second question, and I'm going to start again with Pamela, if that's okay. Thank you. So what are some truths that we must contend with to transform settler-newcomer relationships with Indigenous peoples?
One of the things I was thinking about as both Muna and Nada were speaking was, you have to understand that although this is part of, for example, I'll sit in my own narrative. This is part of my story. There are parts that have been hidden from me for my protection. And so when you're forging these relationships with Indigenous people, we may not always have the answers. One thing that I can say, like lately with the things that have been happening, is those stories have been coming to light in our families, and they have really been opening up the opportunity to kind of unvault the legacies of colonialism through our families. And I think for me, that has been really great. I think we need to understand also that there are boundaries in those conversations, and it's through building relational trust that we can kind of, again, open that doorway and let each other, it's almost like you're showing each other your souls, like you're just really showing who you are to the core of your humanness. And I think the one thing that I think is important, like I just can only speak about like concrete examples. So through my relationship with Nada, like she showed me something, and it showed me that, you know, one, and I knew this, but I think sometimes you know things academically, but you need to hear them through stories of others to just give them, I guess, humanize the story, right? And so we are not the only colonized group. Like we are the colonized group in Canada, but we're not only the only colonized group on the surface of this country, or of this whole world, right? So I think we can find a lot of connectivity with one another in our stories. And through that connectivity, it gives us strength to kind of show more of the truths. Relationships are at the core of all of it. I'm not going to lie, we don't trust easily. And that has been, you know, through those legacies of colonialism. It's like you're going to take a risk and show me something openly before I'm going to even think about, you know, building a truth-based relationship with you. You know, when we talk about, you know, ongoing erasure, I don't know how many more signs we need that colonialism has happened here. I said just the other day, I was talking to my dad and I said to him, you know, like they have shown so many examples, but I mean, it's children's graves now that are coming to light. Like, what more do you need to see to learn, to understand, and to know that this happened? And, you know, someone said to me, it's in the past, it's happened so long ago. So the one thing I want to add to, you know, we talk about residential schools, we talk about 60 Scoop. Don't forget that when the government stopped funding these residential schools, churches continued to operate schools in our communities. We call that Indian Day School. So for me, I'm an Indian Day School survivor through the legacy of my father. And so my father, not my grandfather. So this is very much real to those of us here right now in this physical world. It is not something that's in the past to us. These are things that we are reconciling. And sometimes we just need a little space for that reclamation and that reconciling of those truths as well. So understanding that everyone's story is different, everyone comes with their own unique experience in colonialism, and needing the time and space to kind of navigate like how much we'll show you through our story and through relationship.
Oh, thank you very much, Pamela, for showing us that trust is very important and the relationship is the vital thing in building relationships. Over to you, Mwina. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Debola, and thank you, Pam. I'm really going to be thinking about that in terms of the stories that we don't share or the boundaries that are needed in the relationship building, which sometimes I think when people are overzealous and are just so passionate I just, let me, it's almost like the fierce hugger and the person's trying to get away, right? Like, no, it's not the ways that you build a relationship. It's okay to go slow and to take our time, and it's actually what needs to happen. And I'm going to answer the question by really situating myself in this idea that, somebody who was born and raised in these lands, to acknowledge that I'm a settler. I think for a lot of people, and too many non-Indigenous people, view the acknowledgement that we are settlers as an attack in and of itself. It took me a while to understand the concept of settler colonialism, and to understand how it's ongoing. It's a process, and it's not an event, right? So non-Indigenous racialized folks need to understand and to teach others, just like Neda was saying, in our own families and communities, because we always say that anti-racism work. Go talk to your racist uncle, basically, like talk to your dad, right? Same thing with settler colonialism, and really helping them to understand this. And for me, I feel like this is easy because I can draw on our knowing of Palestine, and say, this is the history here, and this is what happened over time and what's still happening, just like it's still happening in Palestine. And it's easy when I bring it in that way, my family is able to understand and recognize it. So whatever ways and entryways that we can bring for our families, I think it's really important to do so. And just like Neda said, again, we also need to understand that the settler colonial nation has benefited from putting our communities against one another as well. Like, not only have we, not learned, and through the untruths and through the silences and erasures, but I'm going to share some stories and to try to make this concept a little bit more, or bring it to life a little bit. So think about the commitments made to welcome and support scores of newcomers every year, right? And also with what happened in Syria and bringing Syrian refugees. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, don't get me wrong. But here we're getting, this commitment to support. Meanwhile, hundreds of Indigenous communities are still under boil water or do not consume water advisories. So there's this very real and very valid sense of, the primary foundational commitment needs to be to Indigenous peoples and communities on these lands. And so even though, as in my research, there is this sense that newcomers and especially refugee communities are adequately supported, and especially when you have the intersectionality of ableism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, you understand there are very real challenges, and they're not as supported as many imagine them to be, of course. But really understanding how Canada has benefited really from pitting our communities against one another, and through that erasure, settler and newcomer and non-newcomer must learn the histories of these lands. Like, there's no other way around it, and current realities, and be intentional and consistent, building solidarities with Indigenous peoples, nations, and communities. And it can't be on our terms. Just like Neda was saying, we have to decenter ourselves. And I keep thinking about the word solidarity and how at the root is solid. But solid doesn't mean that you're unmoving, unchanging. Solid for me makes me think of like the tree and rooting it deep, right? And letting it grow in that way, and being steadfast in those commitments. And through that, decentering ourselves, and understanding, the very real pain and histories and truths that have allowed us to be here. Really, I think it's important to continually, recommit and commit and recommit, commit, and to continue to learn and grow. And there's a lot of unlearning that has to happen, as many people have already mentioned, in different ways as well. And so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Mina. Neda, over to you.
I think my co-panelists have beautifully covered everything that I would want to say. I think I guess I summarize it up by saying, in terms of truths that we need to embrace, is that we are beneficiaries of injustice towards Indigenous people. And even though, you know, for many racialized migrants and refugees, we are not coming, you know, that there's that beautiful poem from Shire where she says, you don't leave home unless home is the mouth of a shark. Right. And so for many of us, we are leaving our homes because it is that. But that does not mean that we are not benefiting from settler colonialism and the injustices that have been committed here. And I think then we get here and there's all these Eurocentric values that define this country, starting from niceness and politeness and then individualism, right? So individualism is just a beautiful way how we just get away from any accountability. Because if it's the cornerstone of whiteness, of Canadianness, in that it absolves us of collective responsibility. We can sit there and, you know, marinate in guilt, but at the same time, then just step back and say, well, you know, there's nothing I can do. This is not something that because I didn't do it, and then there's nothing I can do about it. And, you know, as migrants to this land, we have, you know, many of us have, if not still, but initially accepted that multiculturalism is actually a thing. And that really it was, if you read the Multiculturalism Act, it was a beautiful, I put that in quotation marks, way to establish Frenchness and Englishness as founding races, and to completely erase the self-determination of Indigenous people, and then to tag on everyone else as in a very superficial way where we actually hide power and we hide racial hierarchy, so that we're never actually going to engage in real social transformation. And from the beginning, you know, like Canada's immigration laws have historically been racist. And this shift, when it did happen, it was really for economic benefit of the country. It did not happen out of, you know, love for people from the global majority. But at the same time, you know, nobody that was in those early waves of migration in the 60s or 70s was saying, oh, please let me celebrate my language and my food and what I wear in public. That wasn't what people were asking for. Those early waves of migration were demanding anti-racist change that would lead to real belonging, real equity. And so, you know, but this has been a way to really erase the history of Canada, and to at the same time hide the continuation of this racial hierarchy. So I think that's one of those truths that we really need to debunk for ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Nada. And that leads me to my next question. So the next question is open. Anyone in the panel can answer the question. So can we talk about the connections, the way we understand the challenges faced by the Indigenous and settler newcomer communities in Canada?
I can answer. How do you know I'm that person who can't handle silences? I keep trying. It just doesn't work.
Thank you.
No worries. I honestly think, but I do believe it's such an important question. So as soon as I saw this, because we did get these questions ahead of time, and I did make notes because my mind cannot stay focused. This is my inability to stay focused on anything. But I'm going to read from some of my notes. And so a colleague and I are currently working on a paper about our positionalities in North American, what is now known as North America, settler colonial contexts. and the solidarities many Palestinian people and communities have been building with and across movements for Black, Indigenous, and queer lives. So in this piece, we discuss Dana Malwan's discussion of something called, quote unquote, assumptive solidarities. She wrote about how, and I'm going to quote her here, sometimes divergent Indigenous and Palestinian concerns are distilled into singular, indistinguishable, and uniform sites of mutual struggle and resistance. In the genuine desire to find solidarity between and amongst our peoples, we often unconsciously disappear the particularities of one another's histories. And so this was for me very evident in many of the protests in support of Palestine and Palestinians that were held in communities in what is now known as Canada during the recent bombardment of Gaza. So many settler newcomer communities joined these protests waving both the Palestinian flag and the Canadian flag, which was a hypocrisy many people online and on the ground, including myself in all honesty, pointed out. Another example that was prevalent online, at least from what I noticed, is that the image of Palestine, and you've seen that famous image of Palestine from 1948 to 1967 and so forth, just the dispossession of Palestinian peoples and communities over time. And then there was this image that was being shared of what would you do or how would you feel? And it was either America, same type of thing, that if the same type of thing happened to America, or if the same type of thing happened in what is now known as Canada as well. And without the real acknowledgement that it has and is happening. So this illustrated for me the lack of awareness and self-awareness that many settler newcomer peoples and communities, including I'm a Palestinian, and I was really disappointed to see these erasures and without the acknowledgement of our own positionality as settlers on these lands. So I think it's important to talk about the different intersecting and violent systems without collapsing differences, right? So yes, we are all positioned within different systems of anti-Black racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, misogyny, and all of these systems which are so violent, but we cannot co-opt or erase the fact that this country was and is built on the ongoing colonization, genocide, and oppression of Indigenous peoples and communities. So this truth, alongside building relationships, as both Pam and Neda have already really pointed to, needs to be central in our organizing. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Okay, who wants to go? Pamela or Ned? Thank you.
Okay, I'll go. Okay, so I think we can't take any specific time period and then say, oh, well, look how bad it's been. But I feel like if I'm just going to take recent history in the last few months. And so in addition to the confounding usual weight of the colonial histories and resistance, there is, of course, the uncovering of the remains of Indigenous children that's happened across the country. And, a number of people on social media have referred to these as, crime sites, basically. Because this is going to continue to happen. And there is nothing like the destruction of a community like the stealing of its children, right? And when Muna brings up the flag, I think the irony was, I felt like I was doing a face plant constantly when I saw messages rolling around that school boards were going to lower the Canadian flag to mark these uncoverings. I'm like, so the very same flag that we were raising that allowed this to happen is now the one that we are putting at half mast. Like, what talk about performative. And so, and as the news from the residential school in Kamloops first broke was the same day as the pictures of 67 Palestinian children were published in the front page of the New York Times. Now, you know, I'm not promoting the New York Times, but that's a conversation for another panel. But I just think that, you know, when we want to, and then only within a matter of weeks, we saw the murder of the Afzal family in London, Ontario, which has been described as a hate crime, an Islamophobic attack. And so when you look at the enduring pain, you know, this is all the function of white supremacy and settler colonialism continuing to be enacted and working itself out on all of our bodies. And so, you know, like we need to acknowledge that, you know, Canada's Indian Act from 1876 is central to Canada's identity, and it continues to be in place, and that Canada was actually an architect to apartheid, which informed both what happened in South Africa and what is the current state of Palestinians living under Israeli occupation, living under Israeli repression. And so, you know, as a Palestinian and settler in Turtle Island, I really know that liberation and self-determination don't come from accepting crumbs from colonial power, right? And so that resistance and holding steady in the face of this erasure and this silence can only be, it's collective work that we need to do together by connecting the dots. And it always has to go back. So for me, I think, you know, when I was doing my introduction, I said like there was a time where it was, I almost felt like, okay, well, we do solidarity because, you know, I'll show up for you here because you're going to show up for me here. And that's not really solidarity. That, you know, if we begin by asking whose land are you standing on, and what is the truth and the pain and the repression that this land holds as a memory, then you understand that all of the work that happens on this land has to be in the context of working against settler colonialism and for advocating and supporting Indigenous self-determination. So, you know, whether we're talking about, you know, class struggle, anti-racist struggle, like that will not come to fruition unless we begin with deconstructing settler colonialism. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much, Nada. Hamala.
Sitting here and I got to work beside Nada and we did some work, and then now I'm listening to her and I'm like, I'm kind of missing working with you. But, you know, when we started out with the Canadian flag, Jay Sewell I love how we're always labeled as activists when we speak up about injustice. So Jay Sewell is an activist who said, why are we flying them at half mast? We should be flying them at full mast, meaning drop the whole thing. So, you know, like we all are with you in terms of that's just so performative. And I think I even tweeted something out about it. When we think about the divisiveness, I think there's so much connectivity, one, in our cultures, two, in how we've experienced colonialism, how we still experience colonialism today. But one of the things that when you were talking about the graves of children, you know, it was very evident when the colonizers arrived that the women were the core of our communities. That they made the decisions, they ran the show, and everything operated so smoothly because the women were at the core of it. And how do you break a woman? You take her children. That is the one, you are born with those instincts, you are born with that love, and you want to share that love with your children. And so we need to remember those are huge scars that we're still bearing today. A lot of families, like I just look in my own family, like we're huge. And one of the things that I remember as a kid was my Uncle Alan always was fostering children. He was trying to keep them out of the system, because after 60 Scoop, we just became a targeted group. If you were Indigenous and you had a baby, social worker would show up at the hospital and do a check-in. They don't do that for everybody. And so my uncle fostered many children, including some of my first cousin's children, to keep them out of foster care. That's so generational, because now I see my Uncle Alan's grandchildren fostering children to keep them out of care. It's something that many of my cousins have done as part of their career, just as part of being a good family member, knowing that, you know, they could have a shot if they just get a little bit of love, right? We need to be mindful of that. I mean, that is, and then the graves being uncovered, gosh, the number is going to continue to climb. But we need to remember that wasn't the only way that they hid the bodies, right? These residential schools were filled with very big furnaces. There are stories of screaming children. There are stories, if you sit with survivors, they will tell you what they've heard in those places, and what they've seen with their eyes, and what they were told never to share. So just imagine carrying that in your body, like just the trauma alone. When we talk about, you know, Muna, you talked about divisiveness within your communities. We experience the same thing in ours. We have so many different labels. You know, we have status Indians, we have non-status Indians, we have Métis, we have Inuit. When the Indian Act was first created, it was directed directly at First Peoples, so First Nations peoples. The Métis were then created later, you know, because they're two groups being brought together. The Inuit were found later because they didn't go that far north. They didn't know there were others. So when you talk about that, we experience that in our communities. They were formed by the Indian agent. They were formed by people taking names down around a table. If you were not sitting at my house that day, she got on the list, right? They don't have any way of checking. And so you have these individuals living in our community who are not original people. You also, through the Indian Act, God, it did such a good job of destroying the unity that we could have had in our communities by really continuing to attack women, stripping them of their rights if they married non-Indigenous men, reinstating those rights. Oh, and if an Indigenous man married a white woman or a non-Indigenous woman, she became full Indigenous. So you have this kind of mess of individuals, even on our current chiefs and councils in our communities, who aren't even Indigenous at all, right? Kind of making decisions for our community. You have these structures that are, right now, they're making me crazy. I don't know if you're watching the, oh my gosh, national chief elections have been going on for the last 24 hours. Roseanne Archibald just acclaimed because Reginald stepped down and withdrew. But why? Like, I don't even understand their purpose. So these structures are not created to help us achieve what we need to in our communities. These structures are created to kind of silence, push us aside, and let Canada continue its agenda and genocide. And that we're seeing it today. This is not something from the past. The Indian Act, although the most amended piece of legislation that we have here in Canada, is still in act. It still regulates how our elections happen in our communities. Our chiefs run 2-year terms. What are you going to accomplish in 2 years? They're not set up for us to succeed. You know, and so unfortunately, sometimes we have to leave our community to become educated and come back in and say, this is how we have to challenge the system. These are the moves that we need to make. But when we're talking about Indigenous people and settlers who come to this land, I really want us to think about, we have a lot of parallels in our stories. And there is a way to stand beside each other in solidarity. And like Nada said, not like in the tokenistic way of, you know, I'm going to go there and you come here with me. It's really about understanding our story, thinking about when you need to stand in front of those tough situations. Of me, for example, because I'm just too triggered in the moment to address it, that's when I need you to step forward for me. And then when you are feeling triggered in the moment, I can step in front for you, because it's okay to not be strong all the time, but we need to find people who can balance those strengths for us so we can both move forward in a way that really centers our kids first, and really decenters racism in our structures and in our systems.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you, Pamela. My next question is, what are some of the ways you see settler colonialism shaping the daily experience of Indigenous and newcomer communities in your personal and professional life that you want listeners to trouble and challenge? I'll go with Nada.
Okay. I feel like we've started kind of pointing in that direction in some of our previous responses, but I think that the interconnection between the different ways that white supremacy continues to play out in structures. So I think, for example, like I guess I'm thinking about self-determination and the connection to borders, surveillance, securitization, which are issues that racialized communities in general experience, but I'm thinking particularly when I think of Muslim communities across Canada. So, it comes back to this idea of who belongs and who's legitimate in this land, right? And so when we began our conversation, we talked about the fact that that Indigenous communities and newcomer, particularly racialized communities in this land have been pitted against each other, but it's a triad, right? Because who's in that third part of the triangle? And that's the white national, the white Christian male, able-bodied national is the one that is defined as Canadian. And we know that in that when, so many of us get the question of where are you really from? Because what has been defined as Canada first begins with the erasure of colonial history, but then, the stories that Canada tells itself about what is Canada doesn't include me. Doesn't include anybody on this panel, actually. And so, so long as we discredit, erase, silence, remove the self-determination of Indigenous people, and when we say land back, like I think this is not different than when Palestinians are saying from the river to the sea. We are not talking about violent removal of people from the land, because guess what? That's what's happened to us. It's so when we are talking about land back, we are talking about going back and honoring the treaties and the learning that I've so generously received about traveling in two canoes down the river beside each other. Like, so what does that look like? I mean, that is almost a revolutionary idea. But that means that we need to unpack and dismantle the structures that maintain this kind of triad of separating based on who gets to belong in Canada. So the over scrutiny of Muslim communities, okay, well, we're good with Indigenous resistance so long as it doesn't disrupt the train schedule for too long, right? So like we need to go back to what it is that is maintaining the status quo. and that our solidarity and our actions are not just, you know, showing up for events, not just showing up for protests, but actually examining how is it working itself out in our particular environments. So for me as an educator, what does that look like in my schools? How are the colonial realities and racist realities playing themselves out, from everything from hiring practices to curriculum to even the way the, you know, the in-group and the out-group in any staff and plays out. So we need to be looking at these things, and because they're so invisible to us, and they're what maintains the reality of settler colonial relationships.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nada. Pamela.
You know, I just think we need to not be perpetuating whiteness in whatever role that we have. And I think we need to really know, I always say, I think I'm like a broken record. Like, we need to understand who we are in the body that we're in, and then how that is then placed within these structures and in these systems. And it isn't until we figure that out that we can truly lead in our own way, whether that's through our spirituality, our culture, our faith, you know, whatever that is that makes you whole. I think that if I have one ask, it's to those who are racialized and indigenous, you know, you need to, you got to stand beside the right person. I sit in meetings sometimes and I watch the perpetuation of these systems through, you know, our newcomers, because they want to please. And I get it. I was there too. I was there for 25 years and I was like, what am I doing? And then I had to start figuring out who I was. But we can't just assume, no, that's not where I want to go. I think we just need to make sure that we're not perpetuating all of those negative pieces, because when we do that, we, through silencing, through speaking up for the wrong, like there's always sides. Like, as much as we don't want to say we're divided, when you're entering spaces, there are sides. There are sides, I want to say, for the kids, for the children in the capacity of education, and there are sides for themselves. And I think you have to understand how to navigate and read between the lines on that, and then how then you challenge that. For me, I always make an assumption that I've been proven wrong a few times, that people who are not in white skin are with me in the work. And I've been burned. I've been burned actually quite a bit. And that's why relationships, and I'm sure all three of us will keep saying the same thing, relationships are at the core of this, and trust is really at the center and the core of that relationship. But, you know who you are, and don't compromise who you are when you come and you're a newcomer to Canada. Keep being who you are. And I know firsthand it's not safe. I've watched that violence against me as an Indigenous woman. I've watched that violence against my friend Nada in her identity. I have witnessed it, and we witness it in the media. So, I mean, but these are people I love that I'm witnessing this with. If we don't start naming it, if we don't start standing together, if we don't support one another, it's never going to move forward. It's going to stay in that status quo spot, and we can't. We all have to. I just keep saying, it's my kids. I don't want my kids to be growing up this way. I want them to be who they are, to the core of their humanness. And I think that if we continue to speak up and name and then create actions that change, actionable change, then I think we could move to a better place.
Thank you very much, Pamela. Mina, over to you.
Thank you, Adebola, and thank you, Pamela and Nada. I think that you've touched on everything that I wanted to say here, but I do want to pick up the thread a little bit. I'm sorry, you're going to hear in the background, my youngest is just coming home, so I apologize in advance. But there's so many ways that settler colonialism shapes us and our experiences and our ways of seeing the world. They're so often unquestioned and unnoticed. So for me, this is why, as an educator and as a teacher educator, I asked pre-service teachers to construct something called the curriculum counter cartography in my social studies methods course. And so what it is that the acknowledgement that curriculum is not just the program of studies. It is what students and what we've learned. What have we learned? What is the curriculum we've composed over time or co-composed over times? Or sometimes the things that we've been taught that maybe we should not have been taught. Curriculum is much larger than the program of studies, and it happens in places other than schools as well. It happens around the kitchen table. It happens in the playground. Children and youth are learning constantly in different places. So what we've done is, and when I say we, I'm talking about my good friend, Dr. Breton Varga, because he works in critical kind of cartography work. And we begin by clearly stating that maps and map making have and continue to be tools of colonization. So we really challenge pre-service teachers to think about the curriculum that they've composed and who they're becoming as pre-service teacher educators, who they are and who they're still in the process of becoming. And we ask them to really calibrate their ways of understanding the spaces within which they've composed their lives. So we ask them to think about what are the history of these places? What are the histories of these places? Who has traditionally, walked in these lands and lived and, gathered here? How has their, and so even my being in these places, so really situating yourself, how has my being in these spaces and these places pushed out other human and more than human beings to make room for me to be here? And who has drawn the borders of these places, and why have these borders been drawn? And so really what I'm trying to get at is that all settler newcomers need to grapple with these questions and also be aware of emotionality. I always talk about emotionality in the work too, because I know for a fact, because I do with pre-service teacher educators, I'm teaching adults and oftentimes adults who already have had one degree, and so they have a lot of experience as well. And so the unlearning is really, it's challenging for a lot of people. So it's not uncommon for discussions around the intersections and overlappings of settler colonialism, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Muslim racism, anti-Asian racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, misogyny, xenophobia, so many of the violent systems and structures that we sometimes find ourselves situating to become imbued with defensiveness and anger and guilt. So this is where I'm going to remind any and all settler newcomers who listen that our own feelings cannot and should not be centered, and they cannot and should not take over much needed conversations. I always remind people, if you need to leave, leave, but do not take over the conversation. If you need to take a moment, go outside, take a breath. When it was online, I said, leave the meeting room, turn off your camera, mute me, but don't take over the conversation. So an example of the ways that this plays out sometimes in online spaces, and I'm going to give another anecdote here. So on Canada Day, my sister responded to a tweet because there was the hashtag Cancel Canada Day trending. And so my sister, I saw a tweet that came to my attention because my sister responded to it. And so there was somebody who said something like, I know there's a lot of pain and people suffering, basically, like, but so you know that the second that comes in, it's going to be completely denying what they just originally stated. But hashtag Cancel Canada Day but basically, I was at a Canada Day celebration a few years ago, and I spoke with a refugee woman who cried tears of gratitude. Don't tell me her feelings aren't valid, something like that, to that effect. And so my sister responded with, how about we not pit Indigenous pain and truth against refugees' pain and truth? Which he responded to, obviously, like, not obviously, but I mean, for people, for anybody who follows social media, I mean, it's a hell site. So truly, I love it. So anyways, he responded with defensiveness, and I got involved to say no, because he wasn't there for listening. And yet he was using racialized refugee woman as a prop to his apologist and denialist stance. And it did anger me, because that's how these kinds of conversations are too often had. So I think for me, it's always being aware of the potential triggers and traumas that will be implicated in these conversations is a good idea too, because we all have intergenerational and experiential trauma in some way, but we can't center ourselves, and we really need to think about the ways that sometimes the ways that we project what we might be feeling inside is actually perpetuating violence and harm in different ways as well. And so that's really what I bring forward for my students.
Thank you very much. So I have two more questions. I want to just quickly go over them. The next one, what does decolonizing Indigenous and settler newcomer relationship mean? What does it look like? Hamala, do you want to go first? Thank you.
Sure. I think part of decolonizing is really humanizing our relationships. My auntie often says that, colonialism has taught us to connect head to head, but the true connection comes from heart to heart. And so for me to decolonize them is, again, circling back, I think, to one of my first earlier comments, is really getting to know each other to the core of who we are, listening to our stories. People who know me and get close to me will get to know my children. That's how we've built ultimate trust. I don't just share them with anyone, because nobody needs all of that sometimes too. But for me, that's how we're in a good place of trust. Humanization of anything is actually quite challenging when you're living through the legacies of colonialism. I see it perpetuated through education in every way. I see it perpetuating through curriculum, through assessment. Oh my gosh, don't even get me started on assessment. I see it perpetuated, in every aspect that we look at children and evaluate what we believe their intelligence to be. However, I've learned and tried to model that by learning about student stories, by connecting with families through the heart, not through the head, we truly can serve our students. And so I think for me, that's the primary, I think that's the starting place, is humanizing it. It doesn't become, what can I get from you and take from you and extract from you, but rather, how can we move together in a really honest, humble, and honoring way. And I think that is really the true definition of decolonization.
Thank you very much. Nada.
I guess I would add here that, so recently, part of a conversation about Islamophobia, we talked about the fact that you don't counter Islamophobia by learning about Islam. I don't need you to pick up a 101 book about what the Muslim faith is to work against Islamophobia, because it is a form of racialization and racism. And, I connect that to a teaching that I received from Indigenous elder Nancy Rowe, who basically said, get out of my culture. So it's not about learning about Indigenous ways of being in the world and knowing in the world, and the 7 grandfather teachings that get posted in classroom walls without any actual understanding of where they stem from. And then don't even get me started about the cultural appropriation when we start seeing paper towel rolls turned into totem poles and et cetera, all the other offensive practices. But I think that you don't counter a settler colonialism, and you don't engage in decolonization by engaging in an anthropological study of Indigenous communities. Relationships are, you start with yourself, I guess, as Pam said earlier, is that we need to know who we are. We need to be able to understand how we are located on this land and how we are complicit. But then we also, and then in building relationships to Indigenous communities, it is to foster a relationship to struggle and resist together, not to then be taught about culture so then we can understand. If you want to understand how colonialism is operating, then you look at the policies of the land, you look at the courts, you look at the social services, schools. That's how you see how colonialism is operating, and that's actually where we need to struggle for decolonization. And then to come back to Muna's earlier point about emotionality, is that, and in this struggle together, we also need to make space and respect whatever emotion that Indigenous communities and Indigenous individuals are going to be embodying at that time. Anger is a legitimate emotion for injustice and violence. And pain, crying, whatever it is, that's not about me as a settler, and then dealing with my guilt. And, I love what Muna said about, just leave. Nobody's saying you need to be here. And so in walking together, we need, in the relationship that Pam is referring to, is the container that allows us to hold all these different pieces around knowing ourselves, being in relationship, and at the same time focusing on changing systems and structures without feeling that we need to become experts in cultures. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Lena.
Yeah, thank you. So it's hard to be the last person because brilliance that Neda brought forward. And here's me thinking, okay, so what I prepared, you've already said it and said it so beautifully. So I won't be repeating, but I do want to bring forward this idea of how important it is to not reinforce white supremacist logics within our movements. And I find that so often, too many people, I feel like, want to build just a different kind of hierarchy, right? Within, and of course, I'm not talking about Indigenous peoples. I'm talking about non-Indigenous racialized peoples as well. So who gets to claim solidarity, which is or allyship, which is the new, I guess, I don't know. It's ridiculous to me because you don't get to be the person who claims this. You are invited into a relationship if you've earned that trust. So I think it's so important to recognize that, just like Pam said, the need, and Neda, the need to enter into relationships with humility. And I always think about, there's this Islamic concept that I always think about, even in my own engagement. And it's this concept of niyyah. So this niyyah is intention, right? But it's not the intention, like, as many people pointed out, it's not impact over intentions all the time, right? Like, just because I didn't mean to hurt you, if you're telling me I've hurt you, I need to acknowledge the impact of what I might not have intended to do. But no, the Islamic concept of niyyah is a lot more broad. It's this idea of the spirituality and also the interconnectedness with others, right? This idea that the spirit that I'm bringing into this space, into this world, within my engagement, what kind of a spirit am I engaging with? And so for me, it's the need to engage in good ways, in ways that are sustaining and nurturing. And so through my engagement, am I doing that? But also, am I not holding back because I'm afraid? if I feel like my words will hurt others, I might try to frame them in ways that won't be as hurtful, I guess, especially in my classrooms. I'm going to say it. I'm going to say what needs to be said. And so I'm thinking about the media all the time. And there's the concept of renewing those intentions, like, what spirit am I bringing? And sometimes, like Neda said, that spirit of anger, that righteous rage at injustice, that's okay. That is a very valid response to injustice. So I really like that. But I also want to think, I want to really also think with Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang's amazing work and paper, which is decolonization is not a metaphor. And really, we got to, it bugs me when I see decolonize this and decolonize that. And I think I'm not alone in this, because as both Pamela and Neda said, there's no such thing as, decolonization without following the lead of Indigenous peoples, nations, and communities. And what are they calling us towards in terms of, hashtag land back, or, in any of the different struggles that might be across these lands. I think it's so important, again, to engage with humility and in relationship.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Thank you all for reminding us that following the lead of the Indigenous peoples is very important. Thank you very much. And that leads me to the last question for tonight. It's a little close to the question I just asked, but I'll still, take it, and hopefully we'll have a response or two or three to the question. So in what ways can we disrupt and reimagine this relationship? The relationship between Indigenous and settler newcomer community. Who wants to go first? I'll pick. Over to you, Nada.
No, I think I'm going to let Muna go first.
That's okay.
I unmuted because I couldn't handle it. She
was the last person for the previous question, so I needed to call her again. But it's okay.
Thank you so much. I really want to think about, I don't know, I think that we really need to acknowledge that context matters, and to follow the lead of those who've been really on the ground doing this work for years. And I honestly do think if we do this and engage with that humility, but also with that core commitment, that we do have a chance at abolishing these systems that are so violent. And I want to really think about how we root. Remember that solidarity is that stability that I was talking about. And I do use the metaphor of rooting, growing, planting quite often in my work. And I think about rooting our solidarities, movements, living, scholarship, teaching, and engagement with what Dr. Dwayne Donald conceptualized as ethical relationality. So as a descendant of the Amiskwichi Wiyunwak, which are the Beaver Hills people and the Papasachi Cree, he wrote, quote, "Ethical relationality does not deny difference, nor does it promote an assimilation of it. Rather, ethical relationality supports the conceptualization of difference in ecological terms as necessary for life and living to continue on, as it guides us to seek deeper understandings of how our different histories, memories, and experiences position us in relation to each other," end quote. He then adds, quote, "Ethical relationality is tied to a desire to acknowledge and honor the significance of the relationship we have with others, how our histories and experiences position us in relation to each other, and how our futures as people in the world are similarly tied together." And I also think of my grandma, Siti Sharifa, Allah Yarhama, and the curriculum of Rahma she lived and composed alongside all of us who were blessed to have known her. So Siti Sharifi, Allah Yarhama, she lived with a bullet in her back after being violently displaced and dispossessed from her very small village in Qadasafad in Palestine. And although Rahma, the curriculum of Rahma, when I'm referring to it, Rahma is an Arabic word that's often translated as mercy, and it's just a simple translation. But the curriculum of Rahma that Siti composed and lived alongside me was so much more complex, ethical, relational, and profound than that. The root of the word Rahma is Rahim, which is womb. And so the Rahma is also understood by many Arabic-speaking and or Muslim individuals and communities as being strongly related to nurturance, compassion, and love. However, in our familial curriculum making, Siti continually reminded me that love and compassion inherently dwell alongside equity and justice. So she taught me, and I've been trying to live this in good ways alongside others, that living and embodying a curriculum of Rahma is an act of what now I understand is an act of what Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde conceptualize as radical love against inequitable structures, processes, and practices. And I'm just going to end by saying, by attending to our differences, and yet understanding that disrupting settler colonialism is foundational for the success of all of our movements. We just might be able to reimagine and recreate our worlds in more sustaining ways.
Amara?
Gosh, I sometimes I just think things are so simple. Like I think, when Muna, when you were talking about, your word for intentions, we often people will confuse our language with religion. It's part of that colonial translation. And so, when we use words like pray, in Ojibwe, it's namewen. And so that's for like hopes and wishes and that connectivity to the intentions that you lay each day. We need to remember to always remember our first relationship. And ironically enough, it's not with human beings, it's with the land that we're on. And we need to think about how we are connecting to that land every day. Braiding Sweetgrass is my favorite book. I never even read it sequentially anymore. I'm jumping like into it because there are so many things that the land teaches us about. And when we talk about relationships, I love how she talks about that strawberries were our first teacher of relationships in giving. And so I think we need to get back to those really core values, core teachings from the beginning of our time in thinking about the land. I think that's first and foremost. I think second, we need to understand there's a connectivity there. I remember listening to a survivor at one of our local high schools, and I was sitting beside a colleague. She's Muslim, and the survivor was sharing parts of her spirituality that she felt were broken. But she was nonetheless like sharing that spirituality. And my colleague said to me, my goodness, like, those are similar pieces of our spirituality. Like, this is how we think about it. And so I think we need to, those of us who've been colonized, there's a reason for that. It's to force us to be thinking another way. But there is so much beauty in how we move through this earth and in our physical time here. And I think that there's such a relationship between our two identities, and so many intersections of that, that really could kind of form that foundational relationship with one another and really appreciate it. I think we too, again, need to just come back to humanizing relationships. It's not about what can I get from you? I think we need to transition to how do I get to know you? What can I learn from you? But more like with you, not from you. And I think, as we're moving through, the next, decade of my life, that's definitely been a focus of who I give permission to see me, who the boundaries I lay for protection, but who I let enter with me in those spaces. I think we just have to keep moving forward too. I think honestly, our kids are rocking it. When I watch my daughters and how they move through the system, I just make sure I'm always there to back them up, to help the adult that they're challenging see why they are responding the way that they respond, and our kids are they're so smart, but they're also watching us in how we are navigating this space in this world in these systems. My dream is that we don't have to navigate them anymore, that we can just be in them and they can be equitable. But we have so much more shaking and shifting to do before we even begin to see that. But yeah, I think our kids know it. So how do we create space for them to kind of lead, and then maybe we become more of the guide and the coach, and then that that voice that supports, you know, the resistance that they may face, so they keep moving forward with the knowledge that they have. They're watching. Everything I do is a calculated move, knowing if my kids are watching or hearing me respond to how I've responded to something, and they're listening and learning. So I think for me, those are the key components. And then you just keep moving forward.
Thank you very much. Nada.
Thank you. Well, I'm not going to add too much, and for real this time. I think I think I just wanted to reiterate what we said all along, is that we can't really expect the structures and the institutions that were intended to perpetuate and anchor colonialism to be the ones that lead us to decolonization. We need to be willing to, whether, I don't know if we want to use the word abolish, transform, I'm not sure what word, I'm sure everybody has an opinion on that, but we cannot look to those structures and those curriculum and those ways to lead us to decolonization. And you know what Pam is referring to in terms of our kids is always, I work so hard to not put my fears and my anxieties on my kids, so that they don't have those worries because, you know, one of the most powerful thing that colonialism and racism accomplishes is that we internalize it and that we self-regulate and behave according to the ways that the colonizer wants us to behave. So trying so much not to contribute to that, even though they are getting those messages from everywhere. But, you know, again, you know, like Mama Pam said, just like backing them up so that they can kick down doors and, you know, challenge those structures that get in their way. And also teaching them and ourselves humility in the face of feedback, because we're human and we're imperfect and we're going to mess up. And we're going to hurt people. And, you know, I'm always so aware when I am in my areas of privilege, when I'm speaking and trying to not hurt with my words, but because of my privilege, I know I'm just stepping in it every time. And so then having the humility to actually receive the feedback, should it be so generously offered, and be okay when it's not offered, but then seek to learn and to do better, and not expect people to forgive you, but that, you know, sometimes that going forward means going forward apart, but learning from that so that we don't make the same mistakes. And I think just the last thing is critical hope, right? For me is sometimes I want to, you know, knock myself on the head because I wonder if I'm being naive and hanging on to hope. It is a hope that is informed. It is not, you know, a fatalistic hope. It is a hope that is through learning and trying, but always believing that there is something else is possible. And that's what keeps us struggling together. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Nada. Thank you. Thank you, Mina. Thank you, Pamela. You've all brought a very great knowledge into the dialogue tonight. We are so happy to have you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Right now, I'd like to go to this question. If you have questions from the audience, I don't know if there's any question in the chat right now. I'm sure that, I guess Okay, I don't think there's any question.
Maybe I can ask a question.
Okay.
Just to keep the conversation going. So, well, thank you all for this insightful conversation. And I know that we can't give this specific topic justice in 2 hours to talk about so many things. It's just a starting point. And my question is really, Nada has made some connections to recent event that happened in Palestine, to the Afzal family, to the discovery of unmarked graves. And we have seen a lot of pushback, a lot of violence, a lot of efforts to silence us. And I wonder, where do you find the balance between speaking up, between making sure that you are doing that in a way that won't harm you or harm your family, because there has been a lot of ways to scare us and to silence us and to push us back, and had made us kind of question our abilities to really speak up. So I wonder what kind of ways or strategies that we can continue to speak up and shed light on the different truths, and not being afraid of speaking our truth and speaking our identities, being Palestinians or indigenous or racialized communities. It's extremely unsafe to even reveal who you are and part of your identity when you don't know who's in the room. So yeah, I would like to hear what Mona and Nada would think of these, of this comment.
Thanks, Nada. So thank you, Sada, for your question, because for me, it was not that I'm not afraid. I'm going to be completely honest, especially with what was happening with Gaza, because I've written about being Palestinian, the stories, I've written the history within my dissertation, full well knowing that could mean that I don't get a position. Alhamdulillah, that didn't happen. And then continuing with my writing fully, you know, and my speaking out, but on social media being a lot less, basically being super careful for many years, in all honesty. And then what happened was, when Gaza was being, you know, with what happened at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and then with Gaza, how dare I, you know, I'm scared, I'm still scared, but how dare I not speak out when people are dying? Is where I said, enough is enough. Like, I can't be afraid of losing my job or losing whatever because of my fear. So I was very vocal in that space as well, even though in the past I've kind of limited it to my presentations and my scholarship. But I also want to acknowledge here that, there is something called Progressive Accept Palestine. This is a framing from Mark Lamont Hill, so he writes about it in that way. Basically, that many people, like there's room in social justice movements or whatever, anti-racist movements, whatever you want to call these movements, for everything except Palestine, where there's still huge silence. So for me, it was more like understanding that there's a lot of people who don't understand very much of the histories. But even if they do know and understand, who are in positions where it will threaten them in some way to speak out. Acknowledging that not everybody has the privilege. For me, I have the privilege of, if I, for example, like if I lost my position, we would be okay, for a good amount of time. So I have to also acknowledge that not everybody is similarly situated and positioned, and in order in doing that work for Palestine specifically, from across, outside of Palestine and Palestine. However, as a settler on these lands, there's no option for me, once you know the truth, to not speak out and to not be in solidarity if it's accepted from me, right? So that is where I would be very, very cautious, about like I said, equating and collapsing differences in that way. There was a recent rally, and I'll stop talking really soon, but there was a recent rally here for the 215 Indigenous children who were whose unmarked graves were uncovered. And I think it's Kamloops. I think it was at the very first rally that I went to and vigil. And I was really actually embarrassed while I was there because I, of course, wore my kafia mask to show who I am in this space. This was my way of showing who I am in this space, along with my hijab, of course. But then there was a few people who came with the kafiyas, and I was so happy to see them originally from across the way. And then I slowly saw them moving towards the speakers, and then saying something to the speakers, passing the kafiya. And then I hear this one of the speakers on the mic saying, "We were asked to please remember the children in Gaza to, you know." And in all honesty, I was really disappointed in them at that moment. I was embarrassed because yes, of course, my heart was breaking for the children of Gaza. But this was a space that was specifically for these children who were whose graves were just uncovered. And if that was freely given or offered by someone, that's different than being asked and put on the spot in the moment. So I think that we have to be very, again, it's the humility of knowing, you know, it's not just like, you know, Pam and Neda both said, it's not a tit for tat. I don't give you my solidarity if you give, you know, it's not that extractive, you know, kind of, my kids are yelling in the background, apologize, but that extractive slash transactional kind of relationships. And just again, to really think about relationships and building those, because you can't show up at a rally and then ask for somebody to do something for you. So I'll stop talking.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for reminding us that relationship is the foundation for everything. There's a question in the chat. I would just like to read it. And what it says, what is the suggestion to maintain accountability towards the Indigenous community without violating their personal space? Kamala?
I just put, can you just cut and paste it back in the chat because I got booted out, so it cleans the chat out for me. I'm just better, it helps me focus. After 2 p.m., my attention span is like everywhere but where it should be.
Okay. Someone already posted it.
Perfect. I think Muna spoke about it with the example that she used, and it's really about just knowing your place, and and Neda like referenced the Tura Wampum, of staying, like you stay in your lane and I'll stay in my lane. Like I think that is what solidarity is. And it's one thing, I mean, they both articulated it so well, and it's kind of, I feel like I'm repeating, but I think that, if I was leading something and I mentioned it, that's wonderful. But to be asking us to do that in a moment when we're grieving, and you don't even know the relationship in that grief. You don't know, like that could be, a great grandmother, that can be a grandmother, that can be an auntie, that can be an uncle, that can be someone connected to who they are. And so always knowing when to decenter yourself and allow that to be, allow the Indigenous community to center themselves in the story that they're sharing. I think, the best way to not violate personal space is to not invite yourself in. You do have to wait to be invited. And you have to be waited to be invited into the conversation. There are times where there's a group of us, just having a conversation at a conference, 3 Anishinaabe women catching up. I remember we were listening to Nigon Sinclair speak, and he had mentioned something about his Mishomis making his dad softer. And, Anika and myself were standing off to the side after the keynote, And we said, what is that? What do you think that is? Because, I saw that with my own father, and Anika saw that with her father, that when we had children, our fathers seemed to be softer. They showed a little bit more love, freely. They weren't so like, I feel like they're in full protection mode with their own children, but then when they have grandchildren, they know that you're providing the protection and they can just be, but I remember this woman just came and inserted herself and just was listening, and we stopped and we were like, well, let's just go have supper together tonight, right? And so it's knowing when you have to be invited. You really do. You can't force yourself, because no good relationship was ever forced. I just keep going back to those principles of colonialism. That's a principle of colonialism. You need to unlearn the way that you thought relationships were built, and you need to think about how do you then, again, back to humanizing them.
Thank you very much. There's another question in the chat. I'll just quickly read that. How do you evaluate the image of Palestinian cause in Canada? Also, what has been reviewed about Indigenous children could be somehow a way to lessen our fear as Palestinians from speaking up. Don't you agree?
I think, I don't know if we have the time or to be able to really get into an evaluation of Palestinian reality in Canada, but I think, what I would want to say, and what Muna referenced in her comments earlier, is that connection is not sameness, right? So that we need to, there's been also lots of talk from Turtle Island to Palestine. We've talked about Black Lives Matter and Palestinian Lives Matter, and there was a discussion, can you use PLM as alongside BLM, and what are the limitations of that? So I think what we need to, if we are genuinely working in solidarity with one another, and that it is not just, oh, I have an event, can you show up? I'll show up for your event, but that we are genuinely engaged in a relationship of humility and a humanized relationship where we really know one another, then there is strength to be drawn from that. And then we can see connection and similarities and what we can learn from one another in our struggles without having to equate things. So, we don't actually need PLM. We don't need, Palestinians, we have our own catchphrases and slogans and what have you. We don't need to be appropriating those of other movements. But I do think that the fear is not irrational. It is based on real lived experiences. People's lives have been destroyed professionally and personally in any movement where the dominant structures come after someone. And so there is something to be said about being strategic. This is work that is, all three of us have said, you need to start with yourself, but it is still collective work. And, we move through this world together, and we can learn from one another, protect one another, hold one another accountable, and we make each other brave, right? And I know that I'm more likely to step up. And, I, like Muna, I, have been, the first time I stopped speaking about being Palestinian was when I went into public education, ironically. And so, finding your way back to that has been partly in relationship with Indigenous friends like Pam, and saying that, how can you stand in solidarity and say, bring your whole self, and I'm right behind you, when we don't bring our whole self? So it's in that relationship that we can find our way together.
Thank you. Thank you for answering the question. Thank you for tonight. I'm going to hand over to Gia.
Thank you so much, Adebola, and
You're
thank you,
welcome.
Mona, Nada, and Pamela. It was such an eye-opening and such a positive and reaffirming session. It does always make us feel brave when we are able to interact with other people with similar thinking. I just, I feel that this was very interactive for us, and it was a great opportunity for us to, learn and unlearn. As newcomers, it's extremely important for us. These are the things how we can go ahead and support the indigenous community as well. I just have a couple of takeaways before that I wanted to reiterate. And, I've been noting them down just before we sign off for the night. I know we're at the limit. So very quickly, I'll say that I have, just the importance of relationships has been highlighted a lot. It does not quid pro quo. Like, it's not as if you do something for me, I'll do something for you. It has to be felt. It has to be built up. And that line really resonated with me, that whether we came last week or we came 300 years ago, we have space in this country because someone made space for us. The indigenous people, they made space for us, and therefore we are in a relationship with them. We are accountable. We have that relationship. And just the past events have probably opened our eyes, but it is on us to now educate ourselves. And history does have that narrative that where newcomers are pitted against other kind of people who are already living here. But we have the power and the resources to change the narrative. So thank you so much, everyone, for today and your patience. We will be sending out a post event survey, and please feel free to reach out if you have any questions that were unanswered. Thank you so much for giving us your time on this lovely day. And thank you so much to everyone. Really positive. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.